I'm sure we're all more or less familiar with the political compass. It's been a very popular way for many years now on the internet of measuring people's political alignment. It measures from right to left on economics, that is, economic liberalism versus economic interventionism, and up and down from authoritarianism to libertarianism. Recently, I've noticed a lot of internet political commentators taking this test, so I guess now is as good of time as any to explain the issues with it. To start, I took the test again just now to see where I am currently compared to where I was when I took the test before. It has me slightly right of center on economics and significantly higher on the authoritarian rather than libertarian side. I think the measurement is mostly accurate, at least assuming you accept the assumptions that this test is based on, especially if you compare this test to the older results I got, where I was slightly on the libertarian side and significantly to the right on economics. That is my first problem with this chart, since almost any normal person would say that I'm significantly more right-wing now than I used to be when I took this test before. Yet, if you took a look at where my chart is currently, you'd think more or less I'm a big brain centrist, especially if you compare this chart to the other charts that this same organization puts out. According to this chart, I'm actually significantly to the left of most European governments. That alone should make it pretty clear that there's a pretty significant obvious bias going into this test. If they define literally every single EU country as being right wing, then clearly this definition is not the one that most people use. But okay, I am not using economics when I use the term right wing, so I know what people will say. It obviously isn't fair to criticize this compass for being bad when it registers me as being a centrist on economics, when I am more centrist on economics than I used to be, even if I would be considered more right-wing in other ways. But, even with the terms that this compass uses, are we really supposed to accept that on economics, the UK is one square away from being as right-wing as it is possible to be? What do they define as all the way to the right? Wouldn't that be anarcho-capitalism or something like that? Or, at the very least, wouldn't it be some sort of radical form of right libertarianism? I'm not going to go all boomercon and say that the UK is a socialist country because it has a bunch of nationalized industries, a national health service, and a taxation rate of 34% of its GDP. But does that really sound like one square away from being the ANCAP utopia? And I know what a lefty is going to say. They will cite things like privatization and spending cuts, and yes, I'm sure those are all very bad, and I'm sure they're all very right-wing. But are we really supposed to accept that the UK is literally one square away from being as right-wing as is possible? A century ago, most countries would have barely had any welfare state at all, by modern standards. So, by the standards that are being laid out here on this map, I'd imagine that those countries would be way far off on the right of the chart. So, how is this supposed to be any useful measure of anything? I'm not an ANCAP or a libertarian of any kind, but the scale they're using on economics just seems absurd. Okay, so the test is pretty obviously biased, just from that alone. But hey, everything's biased. I'm sure anyone who has ever actually taken the test will tell pretty quickly the obvious bias that goes into making it. Just take the first question, for example, which is probably the most obvious in the entire test. If economic globalization is inevitable, it should primarily serve humanity rather than the interests of transnational corporations. Again, I'm no libertarian, and I certainly do have a lot of problems with transnational corporations, but just the phrasing of this question really does seem odd. Now I'm happy to say that it should serve the interests of humanity. However, even when I was more or less a libertarian, I couldn't seriously say that I would prefer if globalization would benefit corporations over humanity. So this question is just so obviously biased and pushes people towards the left-wing viewpoint. But that actually is explicitly the point of it. In the FAQ, they quite helpfully admit that they have their questions slanted. They say that the point is to draw out particular types of responses from people. And back when I was a libertarian, this actually did work on me, since even though I couldn't seriously accept the proposition that globalization should serve corporations, I still said that I disagreed with the question, and I remember the thought process. It was explicitly because I thought it sounded like a stupid lefty sentiment. So, they say that's the entire point of having such obviously biased questions. They're to draw out those types of responses. And I do think that's mostly fair. So, though there are serious problems with bias in this test, that particular type of bias in the phrasing, isn't necessarily the way that it's problematic. On the authoritarian and libertarian axis is where the really big problem with the questions comes out, and not in the way that they're asked, but in the results that they will give you. For many of the questions, there are very obvious ways in which they are obvious how they are tied to their result, especially the economic ones. More taxation is more government intervention, so it's more left-wing. Same with environmental regulations and other stuff. It's pretty clear why answering one way or another will push you towards the left or to the right. But for many of the other questions, you might scratch your head and wonder, what does this even have to do with the political compass at all? Many of them have to do with your personal views on morality, or even more abstract things than that, and they don't directly relate to government policy on either axis at all. Like, for example, what does saying that some people are naturally unlucky, or views on sexual morality, have to do with this test? Well, the authors actually do provide a very clear answer again in the FAQ. These types of questions are actually purely based on correlation. That is, the authors claim that determinism is correlated with authoritarianism. Therefore, deterministic answers, like saying that some people are naturally unlucky, or believing in astrology, will give you a result saying that you're more authoritarian. This, I believe, really undermines the test in its entirety, so much so to make it basically pointless. Because the test isn't actually measuring what you believe, it's measuring what they think you might believe based on correlations with questions. Your actual views, the things that you actually call for, could be as libertarian as possible, but if you happen to align with things that are not in themselves authoritarian, but are correlated, according to the authors, with authoritarianism, then it will show up that you are authoritarian. And, of course, the opposite is true also. You could have very authoritarian views, but you could show up as much more libertarian, depending on how you answer these questions that don't directly have anything to do with authoritarianism. This is where the bias really comes through, even worse than most of the prior issues, because most of these correlations are on topics of religion and morality. Therefore, if you hold any sort of traditional Christian moral system, this test will almost always make you at least relatively authoritarian. You could be a full ANCAP, but if you don't agree with the moral fads that have been popular for a couple decades, it will consider you to be much more on the authoritarian side than someone with left-wing social views. The FAQ, of course, goes full Godwin's Law on this. Don't you know, he who shall not be named was a homophobe, and he also didn't like abstract art. Therefore, if you share those opinions, you're an authoritarian too. So, in short, it measures correlations. It doesn't measure your actual views. And when I was more or less a libertarian, I would have expected to see myself quite a bit into the purple. But in reality, I was only slightly on the libertarian side, because I still held traditional moral views, even if I was a full libertarian on how those things should be implemented. Now, of course, I'm not a libertarian of any kind anymore, so you might think, well, it doesn't really bother me that it pushes me towards libertarianism now, but that's not the issue. My issue isn't that it pushes me one way or another. My issue is that it pushes me towards authoritarianism for the wrong reasons. So, both parts of this compass are pretty significantly flawed, as I think I've shown. That alone should be enough to say that the compass is bad, that it's basically useless. But there are even deeper problems with it on top of that. As I mentioned before, most people would say that I'm more right-wing now than I used to be when I was a semi-libertarian. Yet, this chart makes me out to be a centrist, at least on economics. The issue with this chart is that it's based on the false assumption that the left-right divide is primarily about economics, when that is obviously something that we should see as false by now. Politics is primarily about branding, tribalism, identity. We identify national populism, for example, as clearly right-wing, despite many of its economic policies being centrist or left-wing, because we know what it's getting at. The fact that the right and the far right tends to be more economically centrist, or even center-left, than the center-right doesn't prove that they're actually left-wing. It proves that putting economics at the center of politics is missing the point of what politics is really about in the first place. Any political spectrum that has Otto von Bismarck to the left of Ronald Reagan isn't a useful spectrum in the first place. And that is the issue with the political compass. Thanks for watching. Please donate money to my Subscribe Star Patreon if you enjoy my content. And please like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell, and most importantly, share my content with anyone who you think might find it interesting. Really, posting it on social media, sending it to friends, whatever, does help a lot with growing my channel at this side. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.